Would you like to read an absolutely fantastic book on U.S. foreign policy? Join Richard Ebeling and me and special guest Daniela Ganser as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle. The show that y'all know brings you the principal case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host Richard Ebeling. Plus, we've got a really special guest coming to us from Switzerland, and it's an honor to have you, Daniela Ganser. Daniela is an author, graduate of the college at the University of Basel in Switzerland, author of a book called NATO's Secret Armies. But what got my attention was an absolutely fantastic book that he wrote called USA, the Ruthless Empire. Now, Daniela wrote the book or had it published in 2020 in German, but Skyhorse Publishing turned around and published it in English last year in 2023. And the dedication of the book caught my attention. He says, I dedicate this book to all the people who reject war, terror, torture, and war propaganda from the bottom of their hearts and who are committed to peace. And then as I was perusing the book, I saw that he was citing some real heroic figures for me, like Chalmers Johnson and Stephen Kinzer, William Bloom, Noam Chomsky, really heroic on matters with respect to foreign policy. But as I started reading the book, I said, oh my gosh, this is a fantastic book. This guy really has a handle on the real essence of the U.S. government and its foreign policy, and specifically the national security state. I mean, as you all know, I've long said that this is the biggest killing machine, or one of the biggest killing machines in history. And we don't know how many people they've killed in the last 70, 80, 90 years, but it certainly has to number in the millions. So I was able to hunt Daniela down and asked him to appear on the show. And so, Daniela, it's a great honor to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Jacob, for inviting me. And yeah, that's the book I wrote, and I'm very glad that you found it interesting. I'm a Swiss historian. I write my stuff, and if somebody over on the other side of the Atlantic thinks it's worth reading, that's a great pleasure and an honor. Thank you very much.
Yeah, one of the things I was amused about is one of the critics on your Wikipedia page said that you were anti-American. It's the notion that if you criticize the U.S. government, that must make you anti-American.
That's always the trick, is it? That's always the trick.
Yeah,
I'm criticizing the government, not the population.
Exactly. They can't draw that distinction. For them, it's all one and the same thing. So why don't you tell us a little bit, give us a synopsis of the book, what motivated you to write it, what really the essence of the book is?
Some people came to me and said, yeah, you've researched the Iraq War 2003 and said it was based on lies, so that Bush lied to the population. You've researched 9/11. You said the collapse of World Trade Center 7 seems to be controlled demolition. You've researched the war in Afghanistan. You've researched the Second World War and Pearl Harbor. But you've done it in all different bits and pieces. Can you not put it together in one single book? And please write it in a way that people who are maybe 15 or 20 or 25 years old can understand it. So that was really my aim. I sat down to write this book from the onset when Europeans with Christopher Columbus, went across the Atlantic and to the war in Syria today. So the last 500 years, but in a compact manner. That was the idea. And it's always hard to judge for an author whether he has succeeded, but that was the idea. And maybe, if I may add, I wanted to make this distinction between the US population of more than 300 million people and the very small elite, which really runs foreign policy.
Yeah, well, I noticed that I think you did a fantastic job in putting it all together in one relatively short book, but starting up with World War I and World War II, with Richard and I have addressed a long time, and then moving through the Cold War. Would you give us a little synopsis of what you're talking about there in the context of where we are today?
Well, an interesting topic, certainly in World War II. So that's one of the chapters. Also, in the book is in a chronological order, and in World War II, my reading of Pearl Harbor, which is obviously a topic American readers are interested in. My reading is that President Roosevelt knew that the Japanese were attacking, or that this attack was coming. And that then President Roosevelt said, I need to shock my own population, and then say, okay, we were completely surprised, in order to be able to fight Hitler in Germany and Stalin, as you know, make an alliance with Stalin first and then fight him in the Cold War. So I wanted to draw people's attention to this interpretation of Pearl Harbor that I have, that the US government was informed, and that they didn't inform the leading officers who were based on Hawaii. They didn't know. They were out of the loop. And you know, now in hindsight, it's easier to find the facts, but I think it's still shocking for some people to hear this.
Oh yeah, well, Richard and I have written about that over the years. I forget the name of the guy that wrote that book where he talked about Stinnett. Yeah, Stinnett's book. And then
excellent man. And I think that's an interesting thing. You know, he's an American researcher. So I take US research, and then it, crosses the Atlantic, comes to Switzerland. I go through his data, and I think, geez, that's really interesting. And he's got some solid data to back up his claim. He's not just saying Roosevelt knew it, but he says they moved the aircraft carriers away first, and they intercepted all the data. And it was well known that this magic data was kept within Washington, very, very close circles. So, and then it comes to me, and that goes back to you. And so I really appreciate this transatlantic discourse.
Yeah, and they had broken the diplomatic code. They still won't release all the records with respect to whether they had broken the military code, which I think is very suspicious. But the East Wind Rain message and the delay in getting the message to the people at Pearl, it's all very, very, it points in the direction that Roosevelt not only knew, but he wanted it to happen. This was his backdoor to war in Europe.
Yeah, and that, it's for me a very important point to explain to the population in the US and also in Europe that governments very often use tricks to get their populations into war. And the trick is often that they don't tell them the whole story. Of course, the Japanese attack, that's true. I mean, that's a fact. That's a fact. In 1941, this happened. But the full story is that the US government was aware that this attack was coming. And so, that's the biggest trick in military propaganda, just to leave something out.
Oh, yeah. Well, and that the fact that they were squeezing the Japanese with respect to the oil embargo is highly suspicious in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, if I may, remind people of the fact that Japan has no oil at all, nothing, zero. And Japan was, going after conquests in Southeast Asia, attacking one country after another. And now, if you attack many countries, you need oil for your planes and for your ships. Imagine a ship or a military plane with no oil at all, and you can see that it doesn't work at all. And so the Japanese had their oil from the US. The US in the Second World War was the biggest oil producer of the world. So the Japanese tanker would go across the Pacific from Japan to California, get the oil, and then go back and fuel the Japanese war machine. And then Roosevelt decided to not give the Japanese any oil anymore. So the really significant moment is in 1941, the Japanese tanker leaves Japan, crosses the Pacific empty, and goes back home empty. That is the significant moment. If you drive one way and back empty, the Japanese knew after that day that they had to confront the US if they wanted to, then invade Indonesia to conquer oil there. So, that was Roosevelt's calculation. We don't give them any oil anymore, and then they will attack us.
Yeah, and they really had no choice. If they were going to get oil from Indonesia, they had to knock out the Pacific Fleet. And so this notion that the Japanese were attacking to conquer America is such nonsense. It was a very limited war aim. So before we move into the Cold War, though, and the aftermath of the Cold War, let me turn it over to Richard here. Richard?
Yeah, first of all, let me thank you for joining us today.
you,
Jacob often chastises me because I end up being frequently when we have a guest on, the devil's advocate. And my only reason for doing this is because, as you wouldn't be surprised, there are many viewers and listeners in general out there who accept the government's basically court history, as some have called it. So I sort of want to ask you questions or make a comment, which do you respond? For those people who are not familiar with the kind of point of view you and I and Jacob are more familiar with, to sort of
Go ahead.
These things to them. So this is not directed against you, okay? Let's start with the title of your book. The USA, the Ruthless Empire.
Yeah.
One question that could enter a person's mind who saw it in a bookstore is that ruthless empire. Haven't all empires been ruthless throughout history? They conquer, they kill, they dominate.
Yeah. And
that has been the case for all of recorded history and has continued into our own time. So what is it that makes you think of the U.S. As the ruthless empire? What distinguishes the U.S. from other instances of the past or even the future?
No, that's very precise and correct what you say. I mean, all empires, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, the French Empire, have been ruthless. The point really that I want to make with the title is that the US is an empire. Many people here in Europe, I'm not sure how it is in the US, think that, yes, of course, there was a Roman Empire, but, you know, that's 2,000 years ago. And yes, of course, they were ruthless. They killed all along the Mediterranean just in order to conquer other cities. But that's a long time ago. And then people in Europe go, oh, yes, there was French colonialism in Africa, or British colonialism. They ruled India or conquered Australia. And, oh, yes, the French conquered Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. So, yes, there was French imperialism. There was a French empire. There was a British empire. People in Europe are even aware that there was a Dutch empire, which was Indonesia. But then the attitude among many historians, and by training, I have my PhD in history. By training, I'm a historian, is that they say, but the time of empires has ended. You know, now it's just, you know, democracies and, you know, Russia and China against democracies, you know, an explanation like that. And when I say the US is now the empire, they look at me with a bit of a surprised view and they say, no, the US is not an empire. That can't be, because, you know, they don't hiss the flag in Iraq or in Libya and Syria. They bombed these countries. Yes, that's true. That's a fact. But they don't conquer them totally. That's the claim people are making. So the title really is, the emphasis on the US is an empire.
Okay, if I can just follow up with that again for clarification, precisely because many people don't understand this or appreciate it. We usually think of empires the way you've expressed it: the French Empire, the British Empire. They sent forces to other parts of the world. They invaded, they conquered, they imposed their rule. There would be people appointed to administer these areas, like in French Indochina or British India, with British or French officials sent to be the local administrators in these parts of the empire.
Yes.
The United States does not do that. We don't conquer territories in that old-fashioned way. We don't send someone over and to tell the French president what to say, or the British prime minister to say, or what the prime minister of Japan or South Korea should say. We do station troops there, but that's based on mutual treaties between independent countries. So how would you define the particular characteristics and qualities of the American empire compared to past ones?
It is more of an invisible empire, because the United States goes into the country, overthrows the government, installs a new set of leaders, and this new set of leader then agrees with the US on, stationing troops in that country and buying weapons from the United States. So it's true. That's different from what the French and the British did. But still, it is a projection of power. It is a different form of doing it. And I, for instance, show it in one specific example in Iran. So Iran in 1953, they had a government of Mossadegh. He was the elected prime minister, and he was overthrown by the CIA and the MI6. Now, after the British and the Americans together had overthrown the Iranian government, which actually leads to the tensions that we have today, between Iran and Israel and the complicated situation that we are today in. After they had overthrown the Iranian government, they installed the Shah, who was also Iranian, but who then was totally dependent or obedient, if I may say so, to London and Washington. So that's really the difference. Also in Chile, when they overthrew Allende in 73, or in Guatemala after they had overthrown Arbenz, the idea was usually to install local leaders that would then cooperate with America.
But then how would you interpret, again, for our viewers and listeners, how would you interpret the relationship in the way that you've just described these various instances, the relationship between the United States and the governments of Western Europe, the traditional NATO countries?
The original idea is that you don't attack each other within NATO. We now have 32 NATO states, and I'm based in Switzerland. Switzerland is not part of NATO, so I'm outside of NATO, and I'm looking across the Swiss border into Germany. And in Germany, you have some 38,000 US troops. The Germans had, after the Second World War, as you of course know, Soviet troops stationed in Germany. But after Germany was united again, the Soviets withdrew. They're not there anymore. No Russian or Soviet soldiers anymore in Germany. But there still are 38,000 German troops, US troops in Germany. US American troops, and they have a huge military base in Ramstein, for instance, which is where the US military planes would land, and if they transfer weapons to Ukraine or to Israel, Germany military infrastructure, US military infrastructure in Germany would be used, or German military bases, US military bases in Germany were used to train Ukrainian soldiers, and then sent them back into Ukraine to fight Russia. So really, Germany is being used very intensively by the US military. But I give talks in Germany, in Berlin, in Kiel, in Hamburg, in Rostock, and many other places. And then I talk to people and say, do you think Germany is a colony of the United States? And people say, well, we're not allowed to say that. And if you go to Japan, it's the same situation. These countries are nominally completely independent, so they're not colonies of the United States. But if you look at the fabric, and if you look in more detail at that fabric, you clearly see that the United States has a huge influence on German foreign policy. Let me give you specific examples. I have it in that book as well. In 1999, Clinton bombed Serbia, which was illegal. You cannot just bomb another country. And then US President Clinton said, and you, the Germans, you come along, you participate in this bombing. And for Germany, that was a huge change, because Germany had this ideal, or this vision, never again war. After 45 and after Hitler and of all the destruction in the Second World War, there was obviously ample reasons for the Germans to say "Nie wieder Krieg," which means we never ever want war again. We'll never participate in war again. And for 50 years, the Germans didn't participate in any war. And then in 1999, when the US bombed Serbia, the Germans participated in this bombing, which was illegal. And then in 2001, after 9/11, when President Bush invaded Afghanistan, the Germans again participated, because the Americans said, now you come along. There's another war and you come along. The French went along. The British are always there. And then in 2015, when Obama was bombing Syria, they asked Germany to participate in the war in Syria. And the Germans said, no, we don't want to bomb. And then the US said, well, you can just do surveillance flights, and then give us, the places that we can bomb. We will then drop the bombs up, but you check out the country. So the German Air Force participated in Syria, and that has, pushed Germany to a situation where now the German government has sided strongly with Ukraine and against Russia. So it really has pushed Germany into a position where people in Germany go, we don't want that. We don't want that, but we don't dare to say anything against the United States because they're so much more powerful. They even have troops in our country. And if Seymour Hersh is correct, they blew up our pipeline, the Nord Stream pipeline, on 26th of September 22. But you asked me how it feels in Western Europe regarding the US empire. Officially, it doesn't exist. Officially, there's no US empire. Everybody in NATO is equal. But that's just nonsense. NATO is not an equal structure. It's the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, the SOCR, is always an American general. And people who study history or who know geostrategy, they know that NATO is run by the US.
Well, and you've got Chalmers Johnson's thesis of an empire of bases. I think that's the title of one of his books, where they've got 800 military bases around the world. And those are projections of power. I mean, you can control people with those bases. Tell us a little bit about your perspective on the war on terrorism.
I don't buy it. The idea was first during the Cold War, we fight communism, we fight the Soviet Union. Then the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and there was no enemy, basically, no serious enemy that could justify U.S. defense spending, which now is at $900 billion a year. I mean, $900 billion. You need to have a reason to pump such a lot of money to Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Northrop Grumman. But the story then in 2001 changed. So that's 10 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The new story was, now we fight terrorism. And obviously it started with 9/11, and then we had the war in Afghanistan as the first step. Syria was linked to that story. The Iraq War was linked to that story. Libya was linked to that story. But I don't buy the story. I really have to say so. I think the government of President Bush and Vice President Cheney didn't tell the truth on 9/11. I know. I'm not sure how your audience, goes with that topic. But I say that as a Swiss citizen, if I look at the data on 9/11, there's just such a lot of questions. I think the government of the United States has lied to its own people.
Well, there's certainly a split in thinking. I mean, I think Richard would agree with this. Richard and I have always taken the position that it was U.S. foreign policy that motivated the attackers, but there is a large number of very credible people that talk about that this may have been an inside job, at least pertaining to Saudi Arabia, and that there's no doubt that they've lied about the Saudi role in all this. So it's all very suspicious now. But regardless of where one comes out on that issue, the fact is they seized on that opportunity to terribly expand their power, not only with respect to the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, but over the American people with the surveillance machinery we have, as Edward Snowden revealed, and I think you talk about in your book, and all the powers of assassination come to the forefront, and the whole national security state really exposes them being in charge.
That's it. I mean, people can disagree on what happened exactly on 9/11 and who was responsible, but what serious observers agree upon is that this was used by the White House and the Pentagon to expand their power. This is beyond a doubt a fact. And to my mind, it led to imperial overstretch. Overstretch is usually when an empire tries to do many things at the same time. And, it led to drone warfare, for instance. And, at the beginning, you're the only one who uses drones and you think it's terribly smart. You use them in Afghanistan or in Iraq and kill high-ranking generals like Soleimani. This was done in 2020. And now everybody's using drones, okay? They're firing drones at each other, Israel and Iran and the Russians and the Ukrainians. So drone warfare has gone in many different directions. And the surveillance state that you mentioned really is I think one of the things that U.S. citizens are concerned about. I think Edward Snowden is a hero. He made it clear, the government is actually listening in. And if we talk about personal freedom and liberty, then that's something we should always, be against. It's not right, from my perspective, for the government to watch every step I do. In Switzerland, we also had, the government trying to monitor the population, and when that was uncovered in 1990 at the end of the Cold War, it was a huge scandal. But today, people almost got used to it. People go like, yeah, okay, then the government, monitors my every step, but I don't like it, and I will always be against it. But that's just my perspective on personal freedom. I don't think that governments should be handed all power, and I don't think that governments should have the right to monitor people's privacy.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, and there's that saying from one of America's founding fathers: those who would trade liberty for security will get neither and deserve neither. Richard?
And that's true. That's true.
For those who may remember the world before 9/11, two things stand out in my mind. One, the neocons in the wake of the end of the Soviet Union were desperate to justify and rationalize a continuation of America's, in their view, rightly unilateral ultimate control of the world. And their belief that if there's any one country that is not democratic as defined by the United States, then it is in essence a threat to the democracy in America, which means America has to patrol and impose these things around the world. But the question I wanted to raise with you, because again, I think people who either have listened to this or maybe will pick up your book will ask another question. So again, if I can put it in this term, sure. Okay, let us suppose that America had not been this empire. And with the understanding that America has not been and is not the only empire in human history, what would the world have been like in the post-World War II period? Would not it have meant more domination of Europe by the Soviet Union? There were strong communist parties in France and Italy. The French particularly were almost like a caricature of just parroting everything that Stalin said. Would not the Soviets have been more aggressive in the Far East? What would the Middle East be like today? However unfortunate the excesses of the American empire has been, when push comes to shove and the costs are weighed against the benefits over this almost 80-year period, even holding your nose with the abuses, the corruptions, the conniving and the intrigues, what would the world be like today if the U.S. had not done this?
Good question, Richard. The thing is, I fully agree with you that the neocons, really pushed for unilateral dominance. They had a publication, Project for a New American Century, where they actually said, we need a new Pearl Harbor so people understand that we need more defense spending and more military bases and more soldiers all over the place. So the neocons, to my mind, are really that group in Washington, because there are different groups in Washington, as we all know, but that group which really pushed it very, very hard to what I call, imperial overstretch, really. But back to your question, where you said, what if not, if the US had not run NATO, if there had not been any NATO maybe at all? Well, I see now I can maybe speak for Europe, that Europe is really torn in two pieces. We have people forget that Russia is such a huge, it's the largest country of the world, but half of Russia is in Europe and half of Russia is in Asia. So Moscow is a city in Europe, very much like Paris and Rome and Madrid and Zurich are cities in Europe. And Europe consists of this part of Russia, as well as the other part, which is in NATO. And these two blocks are now really like that, you know. Between Berlin and Moscow, there's no peace talk at all. And the French even say, oh, if Zelensky is losing this war, we're going to send French troops into Ukraine. And the Russians say, well, you're crazy. If you put French troops into Ukraine, and France is a nuclear power, and Russia is a nuclear power, then we will kill the French soldiers as enemy combatants if they enter Ukraine. We already see, and that's what the Russians say, that the Germans and the French and the US and the British are arming the Ukrainians. But really, if you send your own troops in there, you know, unofficial, there are obviously some special forces and secret agents there, but there's no official French troops and no official American troops and no official British troops, with the government saying, yes, we're there. Obviously, secretly, there's US soldiers, you know, telling the Ukrainians how to handle the military equipment, but they're not officially there. And if you ask me what else could we see, if not that, then I would like to suggest that we could see a peaceful coexistence. You know, now we have a very dangerous confrontation. We have a very, very dangerous confrontation in Europe, a situation where countries go against each other. And at the end of 1991, when the Soviet Union was falling apart, there could have been the chance that NATO countries say, okay, we close the shop. We close the shop. We don't expand NATO, and we dissolve NATO. So it's very hard for a historian to say, if you know that had happened, what would have been the consequence, because we just have one history. But we clearly can say that there are better scenarios than the one that we're now at. It's a system of confrontation, and if I look at the Ukraine war, it's very dangerous. If the US is now the US government, not the population, has invested another 60 billion into the Zelensky government, and Russia is saying, "What are you doing?" and we just don't want Ukraine in NATO and leave Ukraine alone. And this is nuclear powers going into confrontation mode. That's really sad. And my idea would have been to calm down. But empires do things that are reckless.
Yeah. All right. If I can just continue with this a little bit, you know, we began with the example of Pearl Harbor, and America's entry into the Second World War, and that the Japanese attacked us. Roosevelt goes before Congress for a declaration of war against the Japanese. And then 2 days later, Hitler declares war on the U.S., and of course the U.S. reciprocates, and now we're on both sides of this conflict. But when I know from my own experience is that when you challenge America's events leading up to Pearl Harbor and America's participation in the Second World War, you inevitably are confronted with the following type of question. I'd like to hear your response. Well, if America had not participated in the Second World War and had not assisted in the downfall of the Nazi regime, what would have happened to Europe? What would have happened to the remaining Jews? What would have happened to all of the other inferior peoples that the Nazis, if they had stayed in power, would have continued to eradicate? So America should have stayed out of that war with no consideration of the further millions of lives that would have suffered either at the hands of Hitler or Stalin?
I mean, Hitler and Stalin were clearly mad. You know, they killed so many people, and you're basically right to make the argument. Europeans killed themselves in so many ways. You know, again and again and again. Not only in the Second World War. I mean, also in the First World War. In the First World War, if if I may add, I also have the First World War here. Americans sided above all with the French and with the British. And the French and the British were fighting the Germans. There were other parties involved, but let's keep it on a simple level. And American banks gave a lot of loans to the British and to the French, and they wanted to make sure that these loans get paid back. So at the end of the First World War, Germany was given basically the entire responsibility for the First World War and to pay back all these debts. And the argument can very well be made that the Europeans have, in a very crazy way, always attacked each other and killed each other. So sometimes intervention, if you look at it from the outside, makes sense and say somebody had to stop these people. They were killing each other, killing the Jews in the Second World War, or the French and the Germans killing each other in the First World War. Crazy, absolutely crazy. And once the argument was made that Europeans are from Venus and Americans are from Mars, and the argument was made the Europeans are peace loving because they didn't want to participate in the attack on Iraq, whereas the Americans in 2003 wanted to attack Iraq. And then one German observer very well said, no, Europeans are not from Venus. Europeans are survivors of Mars. And I think that really summarizes it very well. We've had such a lot of destruction here in Europe. We really had a lot. And we're here to reflect on that question. What happens now? We have nuclear weapons. We have huge confrontation with huge new groups. The Chinese and the Russians, they don't take NATO dominance. They just don't take it. And they don't take NATO expansion. They say, we don't want it anymore. And so we're here in Europe reflecting upon all these questions. And these are important questions that you raised. But I say we would be better off, if we don't push it to the brink. And empires very often push it to the brink. And when it all falls down, they go like, oh, maybe that was a bit too much. But, it's we pay in millions as human beings. And some countries have paid a very, very high price, Indonesia or Vietnam or Korea or Afghanistan or Nicaragua. And others have paid a smaller price. Obviously, Switzerland hasn't paid such a huge price at all. The money in the Iran-Contra scandal, when the US sold weapons to Iran and took the money and put it into a Swiss bank account, and then with the money funded the Contras in Nicaragua, because the US Congress had told Reagan, you cannot fight this war in Nicaragua. We're going to cut your funding. And then Oliver North and all the colleagues went into Iran-Contra. So clearly complicated picture. I agree on that.
All right. Well, we're past time, but I just want to ask you about one of my favorite subjects. You've got a chapter, or at least a section in your book, on the Kennedy assassination. And
yes.
I've written several books on that subject, and we've published books on that subject. And so I'd like you to just give a short synopsis, your take. Because to me, Kennedy stood up against all of this, and he paid the price for standing up to it. And I think that message got out to every president since then. So what's your take on it?
I agree with your take. I think Kennedy was assassinated in a conspiracy. I don't think that Lee Harvey Oswald, as you can read on Wikipedia, was this lonely, crazy guy who killed the president and was not connected to anybody. In my book, I have a whole chapter on the JFK 1963 murder. And I think what is really insane is that Allen Dulles, who was the director of the CIA, was in the Warren Commission. He was in that group that investigated the murder of Kennedy. Everybody at the time knew that Kennedy, as president, had fired Allen Dulles as chief of the CIA because Allen Dulles had messed up the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba in April 1961. As you all know, I just repeat it for people who are listening to us. Allen Dulles had made this invasion in Cuba to overthrow Fidel Castro. It went awfully wrong. It didn't work. So Kennedy fired Allen Dulles. And I take it that Alan Dulles then organized a network of killers who then killed Kennedy. It's what people say, the conspiracy theory. Yes, it's the conspiracy theory. I'm not into the lone gunman theory, but that's up to readers to make up their mind.
Okay, the book is USA: The Ruthless Empire, and I highly recommend it. I'd say go out and buy. You get it on Kindle as well. You can get the paperback, but absolutely fantastic book. Daniele, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, both. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Richard, for giving me the opportunity and for having this transatlantic dialogue. Much appreciated. And
you're welcome. Wishes. In fact, if you ever come over to the States, let us know. Maybe we can get a talk.
I will. Thank you very much.
Richard, enjoyed it. I'll see you next week.